So we are the Hungarian Innovators Club, people in Silicon Valley involved in innovation. We are a non-political organization, and we usually have events once a month. And I would very much like to welcome my good friend Anthony, who is going to talk us about the interesting happenings in the in the semiconductor industry. Please help me welcome Anthony.
Thank you very much. Yes, I want to talk today about the U.S.-China techno competition. And, and as I was getting ready for this talk, I thought to myself, it's such a strange talk to make, because when I came to Silicon Valley, which was in 1996, it was an interesting time. It was really the big start of the kind of the whole Silicon Valley model and how it grew. In these early years, I remember from 2000 to 2005, I started going to China quite frequently, and the companies I was with were all, investing heavily in China, especially in building design centers and driving innovation out of China. And it was a wonderful time. It was really a lot of fun. And I traveled across the country from Shenzhen to Shanghai to Beijing and Chengdu, and really was a really optimistic and happy time. And so it's odd that now I'm come here to talk about what has become rather a conflicted relationship between the two countries. So, I'm here to talk about why semiconductors have become really so key in the economies of these countries, and also how they become national security issues for both countries. So let me first start with a quick introduction of myself. My parents immigrated to the United States in 1956, and they met in the United States. And I was raised in Northeast Ohio. And this was a very popular place for Hungarians. It was a big industrial sector of the United States. And, I remember going to markets in the morning where everyone spoke Hungarian. You could buy Hungarian sausages, everything, back in those days. I don't think that exists anymore, but anyway, that's my connection here with the Hungarian community. And I still very much will be there next week, by the way. I'm going to Hungary next week, so looking forward to that. For my education, I studied electrical engineering, but then I went on to graduate school. I studied economics and political science. And I also had the opportunity to study at the University of Debrecen, which was a real treat. I really enjoyed that. My father's side of the family is from Alföld, in a little town called Kisújszarvas, which is not far. Well, it's not exactly near, but it's kind of in the same area. And in fact, I've had relatives who've gone to the university. I spent the first 10 years of my career in the federal government. And in there, I was with the Department of Defense. Also, I was on many foreign policy related types of work. I did that for 10 years. But then in 1989, what happened? The wall fell, right? The Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War ended. And I decided the place to be was Silicon Valley. And I came to San Jose in 1996. It took a while, took a few years. And I've been in the semiconductor industry ever since. And I've lived both in Asia and also in Europe. And have held many roles in semiconductors. I've been in marketing, sales. I've been in program management and different management functions over the years. So that's my background. And one more thing I'll say, these are my personal thoughts. I am not representing any company that I happen to be employed by. I am representing myself in this talk. So if you have complaints, bring them to me. Okay. So I found that around 2010, that if you really wanted to ruin a dinner party, tell people that you work for the semiconductor industry. It just seemed to be so boring. And even though semiconductors was really cool in the 1970s and 1980s, I think, hello, please, sorry. 1970s, 1980s, I think that, well, in 2010 time frame, consumer electronics companies really took the spotlight, and I think that people were more interested to work for companies like Google, like Apple, and other companies like that, and so semiconductors wasn't cool anymore, and it was really kind of disheartening, that people weren't excited about the industry. Interestingly now, though, I can't say that I can be exciting in dinner parties, probably not, but yeah, we really have risen to, as I was explaining before, this geopolitical kind of centerpiece conversation within these two countries, and that I think is pretty interesting, and it's fun to be part of an industry that is now recognized to be so important. So this talk, I have divided it into 4 sections. The first, for those of you, I see many of you actually come from the semiconductor industry, so this will be probably something you already know, but one I want to underscore to people who may not be working in the semiconductor industry is why it's such a foundational industry. I think that's number one. Also, I will be talking about how that is not going away into the future. So you'll need to understand that to be able to understand the nature of the conflict between the two countries. Then I'm going to spend a little time. I'm not a politician. I just want to highlight kind of the key areas of conflict and the reactions to that by both countries to get a little sense of what the geopolitical situation is between the two countries. I have personal opinions about the way the two countries are responding to each other that I think are not helping anybody. But I will share that. These are my opinions again. And then I have my own recommendations of what may work better, and we'll go from there. So, okay. By the way, if anybody has a comment or question, since it's a relatively small group, please go ahead and raise your hand and ask away. I think no reason to wait till the end of the presentation. All right, part 1, globally interconnected foundational technology. Okay, for those of you not in the semiconductor industry, I think it's really illuminating to look at a wafer to understand the core kind of constraints and opportunities that semiconductors bring. This is a wafer. This is a 300 millimeter wafer, and on it you can see the what's called the die imprinted onto this wafer. Now, where this wafer would go from here is that it's going to be diced. It's going to be sliced up, and each one of these squares will be separated out, put into a package, and tested and prepared for a shipment. But this gives you the sense of what the economics of the semiconductor industry is, which is, in order to drive economic value, you have to shrink, preferably in 2 dimensions, the size of the die or the size of the transistors, in either to pack more transistors onto a particular piece of wafer and enable you to do more things, either have more products or have products that can do more things. And that's how you drive value. And for the last 15 years, that's been the fundamental focus. That is the fundamental roadmap of the semiconductor industry, is shrinking the transistors. So often when you hear semiconductor people talk, they're talking about the size of the transistor. By the way, that for me, when I started, I was a government guy, came over to a semiconductor company. It was VLSI technology. It was not far from here. And I remember somebody explaining that to me when he said, look, this wafer costs, I don't know back then, $1,000 or whatever. We pack more, we make more money. And I'm like, oh, okay, yeah. Anyway, I just thought I'd share that because I think it helps for those of you not in the industry. The other thing to know about semiconductors is it is absolutely a global market, and to make a chip from design to delivery, typically materials and product cross over 70 international borders, sometimes multiple times. It is an extremely globally interconnected industry. To underscore that, by the way, when the war broke out between Russia and Ukraine, one of the biggest problems that people identified was, hey, where are we going to get our neon? Ukraine was a big producer of neon that is used in the semiconductor industry process. So that was something that created quite a crisis at the time. But that just gives you an example. But all over Latin America, North America, Asia, all areas produce either rare metals or rare earths and different types of components that are used in the industry. So the other thing to note about the semiconductor industry is that it may have started with these big integrated vertical companies that do everything, that do the design, that do the manufacturing. In fact, when I was at VLSI, back in 1996, they had their own fab right here in San Jose. They had their own fabs, and they made their own chips. They were basically an ASIC provider, but it was very vertically integrated. That is not true anymore. The industry has diversified into major chunks of specialization. And I think there's many ways to slice and dice it, but I thought this was one way maybe that at a high level to get an appreciation of kind of what's going on. Because when you listen to the news, you might hear things like, oh, America's trying to invest in the factories and manufacturing, and there's a lot more to it than those words. And I think you have to recognize that these specializations exist. Number one is design and electronic design tools. That is an area. I like to lump them together. They're famous large companies. By the way, these are not exhaustive lists. For example, Cadence, Synopsys. And then there are design companies such as Qualcomm, such as AMD, Broadcom. So keep that in your mind, design. There's another area, which is the kind of flashing, I'm just hoping it stops, is semiconductor manufacturing equipment. These are the equipment that is used to manufacture chips. And, big companies there that, of course, here in Silicon Valley and also overseas. Materials, I didn't list the companies. There are so many material companies. But by the way, the US is a big producer. DuPont, for example, makes materials for chemicals for the semiconductor industry, but they're spread all over the world. Factories, and also what we would call fabs in the industry parlance. You may have heard of TSMC, which is a Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company, and Samsung and others. Again, this is not exhaustive list. And then finally, test and assembly. This is where you have the die and you put the package around, you test them. This is also very much a specialized area. So,
Question.
Yes.
What's the sort in that last sort and test?
Last what?
What is the word sort, the sort, package and test? I have some idea what package and test might mean. What is the sort?
Well, when you slice up the die and you sort them out to test them and make sure the ones that you want used are going to be selected, that's basically
the sorting good and bad dies.
Yeah.
Okay.
You don't want to send bad die.
Okay.
Yeah. So. Okay, first, where are the design? Okay, design's done all over the world, but in terms of the center, where is the sort of the juggernaut? Where is I would say the main focus is really the United States. When it comes to chip design or electronic design tools, the US has about 90% of the global market share. It's an important point. The other point about design, it's the absolute top of the semiconductor, profitability. It is the most profitable part of the semiconductor industry today, is design. If we move over to manufacturing, it's a little different. Manufacturing equipment, SME, semiconductor manufacturing equipment, where are they made? There are three major areas. Number one is the United States. Number two is Japan. Number three is the Netherlands. That's really the dominant areas where these companies are located. Again, I would say very profitable, maybe one step down, but extremely expensive equipment that is created. Very, very complex. In fact, some of the equipment, we talk about lithography, which is what it sounds like. This is how the semiconductor industry started. It's just like when we used to go to the dark room and make a photograph. Effectively, it's the same thing. We're creating a lithography technology that is probably some of the most complex things that humans have ever done. It's astounding what the technology is to create these machines.
Excuse me, why the Netherlands? I understand the other two, but how come? Over 2%.
There's a good, probably some of you might know the history better than me, but there's a company there called ASML. ASML came to, back about 20 years ago, had come to Andy Grove, who was working at Intel, who was running Intel at the time. And this was a while ago. Andy Grove was still alive at the time. And they knew they had to create this sort of next generation, what's called this extreme ultraviolet light capability to be able to drive ever smaller lithography machines. And at the time, Intel made a huge investment in ASML to start the research and development process. And there's another thing, there's also a lot of, in Europe, there's an extremely effective public-private R&D center called IMEC. I think it's in Belgium. And anyway, this launched a research and development effort that lasted for a long time, that really elevated ASML to the point where today they are the only provider of EUV technology in the world. So that's how, probably if anybody has more background on that, but that's how that's really came together. Basically because of the work done historically over time. So, no, not sure if anybody had any other history there, but that's kind of the background of where they came from.
So yeah. Another question is, how come that profitability is at the design stage and not at the last mile where the customer is? Because most industries, whoever is closest to a customer dominates the industry.
That's an excellent point, by the way, because within the semiconductor industry, typically it's the design company that's the last point. But you think about it, that, for example, a company like Qualcomm designs a chip. It may outsource the manufacturing, but at the end of the day, it's selling the product to the customer. But let me say another thing. There's another phenomenon too. Because let's say that chip is sold to, I don't know, Apple, right? There's huge profitability in an Apple iPhone. That chip is sold for, I don't know, $20 or so. And how much is an iPhone sold for? So it's to your point, I guess the closer you get to the end customer, the more values that they're.
So I mean, oftentimes when you have this kind of vertically separated value chain, oftentimes people say that the biggest profit will go to the performance defining part, that step which really defines the overall performance. Is it somewhat fair to say that the design is still that performance defining subcomponent in that whole chain, maybe?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, absolutely. So let me move on here to, I wanted to talk about the manufacturing piece. So this is the factory now. This is the factory. And again, there are factories in Europe, there are factories in the United States, but I wanted to highlight, when it comes to logic design, Taiwan is absolutely the world's #1 provider of logic chips in the world from a manufacturing standpoint. In terms of the most advanced nodes of logic, I'm getting a little bit of a,
You can see those things. Yeah, HDMI. By the way.
Yeah, chip.
That was sold.
The Communist Party in China.
in terms of advanced nodes, anything below 10 nanometer, they have about 92% of the world's manufacturing capacity. It's a very important point, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Also, memory. Korea is a leader in the memory manufacturing, about 50% of the worldwide market share. So these two countries are really linchpins. They are absolutely important from a manufacturing standpoint. It doesn't mean that there aren't manufacturing elsewhere. For example, Japan also, they build a lot of, other than logic, there's also discrete types of manufacturing of different kinds of semiconductor chips is shared. But in terms of the most advanced, keep in mind, Taiwan and Korea are extremely important. The other point, from a what's the testing and packaging, that also is almost dominated by, not dominated, that's not good. Taiwan has about 50% of the capacity in the world to do that. China's coming up very, very quickly, but that's also done in South Korea and in Japan, a little bit more spread out. But again, Taiwan is in a very strong position there. Yes?
So when this wafer comes out of the factory, sliced, is it something shippable at that moment, or they have to do the sorting right on spot?
You have to package it, typically with
So
packager.
you cannot take the wafer as is, right? Because before packaging, right? So it's not, you cannot ship that thing.
You can ship bare die. There is a model where you ship non-packaged goods. Yes, that does happen, and there are some special cases for that. I would say the vast majority
not
is.
efficient, right?
I'm sorry?
It's not efficient, or is it?
It depends on the application. It can be. It can be. There are applications for it. I would say the vast majority probably is packaged, and then there's different ways to get it ready for shipment. But it does exist. It can exist. I'm not aware of it being shipped out as a wafer. That maybe that exists, but I'm not that familiar with that. Okay, I like this picture. Hopefully you can see it here. What I like about this is when you look at the world from China and you look out over the world, there's a couple of things that come to mind. Number one, you have to recognize through the South China Sea, roughly 35% of the global trade of the world goes through the South China Sea. It's a massive shipping center. Number two, from Chinese perspective, all of these countries, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, Vietnam, they're not exactly as friendly as they could be, right? And so from the Chinese perspective, you can understand sometimes their frustration in terms of the way that they look at the world. The United States had the Monroe Doctrine, where we basically said to Europe, hey, anything in the Western Hemisphere belongs to us. But the other point I wanted to say here is that Taiwan, of course, is claimed by China and it's considered a sacred territory of the People's Republic of China. And not only is the main island of Taiwan only about 110 miles from China, there are islands that belong to Taiwan that are really right off the coast of China, which is very interesting because, you think if they were in such an adversarial relationship, why won't those little islands? I know there used to be fighting and so forth in those islands, but for the most part, they've been left unmolested. So it's an interesting dynamic, but what it does is it underscores the sort of geographic point about the semiconductor industry. You have a country, Taiwan and South Korea, but particularly Taiwan, that is shipping 63% of the total semiconductors in the world. That is 110 miles from a country that's claiming it as their own. So it helps you with the perspective of the sort of geographic sensitivity of the situation. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears. So now, up till now, we talked about the industry. I've given you an overview of what the nature of the industry is like. I want to talk a little bit more about the technology. Does anybody here, most of you are from Hungary, so I don't know if you knew Star Trek. Do they have Star Trek in Hungary? Because I grew up with Star Trek, okay? The reruns. The original Star Trek was in 1966. Do you guys remember Captain Kirk had his communicator? You remember the communicator? He'd be on some strange planet, and he would open up the communicator. He'd often have to dial it, like some analog circuit, and he would talk to the ship, the USS Enterprise. Okay, very important point. The Star Trek series was depicted in the year 2266. That's 300 years ahead of 1966. 300 years. I was living in France about that time, and I had a Nokia phone. By the way, that if I could have called a satellite uplink service, I could have probably talked to the International Space Station. Okay, maybe not exactly the same thing, but the point is that effectively the level of technology that the Nokia phone gave in the mid 1960s was roughly what Captain Kirk was using when he was communicating. And you got to ask yourself, why? Why is that? Why is it that in our imagination, something like the communicator could only have happened 300 years from 1966? And I think it has to do with, as human beings, we're not good at exponential thinking. We're just not. Part of the reason we have a retirement crisis. Nobody understands about compound interest, but I think that's a fundamental problem. And if you go back, let's take a look at Intel. And the reason I want to talk about Intel is because it was around in the 1990s, and it's around today. So we can compare, right? The Intel Pentium Pro had around 3 million transistors. It was around 0.6 micron. That was the gate length of the transistor. Today, there's the Intel i9, has about 26 billion transistors on that circuit. So that's like what, 9,000 times? It's an unbelievable amount of progress in that time frame. The other thing is, we bandy about, we throw these terms out like 7 nanometer, like it's no big deal. 3 gold atoms, 3 is 1 nanometer. We are at the atomic level for this technology. And that is just astounding. One of the biggest issues with semiconductor design today is that we're dealing with a lot of quantum effects in the design of these chips. Quantum effects. These were theoretical, 30, 40 years ago. So that just underscores, by the way, and this is not the most advanced technology today. I just used Intel because they were around back then. But to me, I think this point is very important. I'll tell you why. Like AI, everybody's talking about artificial intelligence. Does anybody know when the fundamental mathematical ideas behind AI were developed? It was like, actually, the first idea was in the 1940s, was proposed and quantified in the 1950s, of the neural network, I should say. The neural network was quantified. The reason why AI is becoming a thing today is because we have the computing processing power to be able to make it work in a reasonable and efficient manner. So anyway, so what's happening? Because of this massive efficiency in semiconductors, it's going everywhere. There's expectation that the industry is going to grow from about 580 million today, a billion, to about 1 trillion by the end of the decade. By the way, $1 trillion for chips, that doesn't mean the value of the things that they go into, like automobiles or handsets or you name it. That, I don't know what that is. That's multiple trillions of dollars. So when people start talking about why is this so important to our economy, you start to realize that chips have become the new oil. It's really the new oil. And by the way, it gets even worse in the future, you could say. Not worse, but better for semiconductor companies. You know, there isn't an area of human endeavor that semiconductor companies aren't going to play a role. I mean, here I just mentioned communications, healthcare, sustainability, transportation. You know, our grandchildren are going to laugh at us when we tell them, oh, we communicated through Teams on a PC. They're going to find that to be so odd, because by the time they become young adults, we're going to meet each other in resolution 3D spaces that look like the real thing. We're going to think about today's technology like we think of the telegraph today. We think of the telegraph, right? We laugh. But that is the world we're going to. Healthcare, a friend of mine had a tumor recently in his kidney. He was operated on 100% robotically. I said, why? Why? He said, because of the position of the tumor. Nobody wanted to do it. They wanted to do it by robotics. Now, for those of you in the healthcare business, that might not be a surprise. When I heard that, I was surprised by that. Sustainability, the whole EV world, the batteries, solar, all of these are going to depend on chips. Transportation, has anybody taken the self-driving taxi in San Francisco? Have you? What's it like? I mean, it must be
Scary.
I can imagine. Does it have a steering wheel or?
I have no one.
Fascinating, yeah. Of course, huge amount of machine learning and chips that go into that. It's phenomenal. So that it just gives you a sense of where this is going. So, countries definitely, the point is, the economy lives off of semiconductor chips, and that's going to continue. But what really keeps politicians up at night? And this is, I have to say, military technology. Is anybody familiar with this notion of the third offset? Do we know what the third offset is? Do you know what an offset strategy is? In 2014, the U.S. Defense Department posited this notion of the third offset strategy. And what they're talking about is this notion. The first offset was in the 1950s. The United States and NATO versus the Warsaw Pact, the standing armies was about 3-1. 3-1 on the Warsaw Pact side. So the first offset strategy was the US started to build nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons was the first offset because NATO countries and the United States knew they could never match Warsaw Pact countries in terms of personnel in Europe. Could not be done, not economically. The second offset strategy really came about in Vietnam when the two superpowers went into a Cold War. A lot of the wars became proxy fights like Vietnam and so forth. And so that there was a lot of emphasis on, munitions that were smart munitions, navigation systems, surveillance, intelligence gathering. Those became the second offset. By the way, you see a little bit about that in Ukraine, because a lot of the howitzers and so forth and HIMARS systems, those are outcrops of smart systems that were developed from the 1970s. The third offset, which is what we're in now, which was identified by the U.S. Defense Department in 2014, is this notion of a couple things. One is man and machine working together in warfare, and autonomy, autonomous systems, autonomous aircraft, autonomous ship systems, undersea systems, miniaturization. So the notion here is that we're entering a world now where really we're becoming sort of man and machine enabled world. And this absolutely requires artificial intelligence, right? So you hear a lot about artificial intelligence. The worries from policymakers on both sides is you really need this for your national security. So anyway, that gives you some sense. Today, if you go to a rock concert, you might see a drone swarm like this. But in tomorrow's world, where these become weapons, if you see this, run, just run. I think it's quite scary to think of this coming after you. But anyway, okay, part one is done. So semiconductors are foundational. They're absolutely necessary for world economic growth. It's a geographically distributed industry with very sensitive geographic situations like Taiwan. Military advancement absolutely depends on semiconductors. And I think that is absolutely what's driving these sensitivities. So let's talk about the geopolitical conflict and kind of my observation of what's been going on. No matter where you stand on the political spectrum, and no matter whether you are allied with the United States, the West, or China and Russia, these are the people who've been running the show. That's just one takeaway. As I mentioned, I think until about 2013, the relationships between the United States and China were, I would say, very collaborative. There was huge optimism. The U.S. had been promoting world trade since the Bretton Woods Agreement. And it was really a response. It was one of those offset concepts where the U.S. thought, look, if we can create a world of allied countries where we exchange and trade goods, that'll make us stronger collectively. And it was a system that worked. It really did work. And China benefited hugely from that system, pulling, 800 million people out of poverty over the course of those 10 years. So from 1993 to 2013, things were very positive. Very exciting, by the way, because the markets were so huge. After 2013, attitudes really began to change. And it was interesting because it was it was changing on both sides, both in China and the United States. China became much more nationalistic, Now, I think from the Chinese perspective, they would say, hey, we want our share. We don't want to be treated poorly. We should be treated with respect. But that led to, a very changed China. They began with the wolf warrior diplomacy, a lot of territorial ambitions, like in the South China Sea, in the Himalayas. There was just a very different stance, a big sense of nationalism that started to occur under the Chinese leadership of Xi Jinping. And that coincided with Trump, who was a populist president who believed in America first. And it was a kind of, the timing was quite interesting. I'll talk about where that went, but really it was Trump that began. There was a situation, for example, with a memory company, I'll show it in a minute, having been accused of stealing intellectual property from a US memory maker called Micron. And that led it to a situation where Trump said, hey, that company can no longer use American technology. And it was the first sort of instance of America kind of weaponizing its control over intellectual property in the semiconductor. And that went on. Then Huawei, you guys remember, was put on the entity list. And of course, there was a big trade war that was occurring that occurred in many, many other products. And then you would think that would change under a new administration. It did not. Joe Biden became even more strict and enacted many more rules. Went much farther than Trump did. This all came to a crescendo around, it was the Winter Olympics in China. It was 2022. It was January 2022. China announces its friendship for life with Russia. And a month later, Russia attacks Ukraine. So the relationship, needless to say, has become incredibly adversarial. I think that, of course, it didn't help that then China was launching massive spy balloons over the United States. Didn't help with the national mood, but that was another thing. But here's what's important. These list some of the highlights, but there's a lot more to this, a lot more details. But you can see in 2018 under Trump, this was where he had blocked the company Fujian Jinhua Integrated Circuit from US technology. And that continued. Companies like SMIC is the Shanghai manufacturing IC. I mean, it's the fab in Shanghai that got blacklisted for any technology below 10 nanometer. And then under Biden, he started going to companies like NVIDIA that were building high-end AI chips and having them stop shipping them to China. And he introduced all kinds of export controls. Yeah, I mean, it really rolled into quite a difficult relationship. But the other thing the U.S. did, which is kind of odd, the U.S. historically does not subsidize things other than agriculture, transportation, and energy. They subsidize those things typically. They don't subsidize industries, not so much. I'm sure we could find examples here and there, but it's not the focus. But they introduced last year the U.S. CHIPS Act, which is setting aside $54 billion for research and development for semiconductors in the U.S. A big chunk of that, $39 billion, is to encourage people to set up factories in the U.S., so manufacturing. There's this sense after the pandemic when we had the massive chip shortage, that we're very vulnerable and that we need more manufacturing capacity in the United States. We'll talk more about that, but it's It was a very odd piece of legislation for the US, very odd. China too had its actions, by the way, and more recently kind of adversarial. China, for the most part, though, pursued what I would call a political economy, a mercantilist political economy, meaning that fundamentally they are subsidizing at a tremendous rate their semiconductor industry. And I'll talk more about that, but they set forth all kinds of national incentives and initiatives. One of them was, setting aside about $180 billion for semiconductor development, especially in manufacturing and design. They're very aggressive, though, in many areas. For example, recruiting foreign specialists can go to China. If you have a specialty and you can go to China and make an awful lot of money by helping out the Chinese cause to build their semiconductor industry. More recently, there have been things that have captured the headlines. For example, they recently announced they're going to license gallium and germanium, which are key components for the semiconductor industry. They make announcements, for example, right when Huawei announced the most recent 5G phone, about a couple weeks later, maybe that day, I think Raimondo, the U.S. Department of Commerce Secretary, was in China. They asked that people who work for the government not bring their Apple iPhones to the office. So that was a national decree. But obviously, what's happening is a tit for tat, and that likely will continue. Okay, so that's just a very high level kind of discussion about the kind of the legal battles here between the two countries. But I believe these policies, by the way, both on the China side and the US side, have limitations. I think that we may be missing the mark, and let me explain why. Let me try it this way. Not letting me move forward. There we go. Okay. Who remembers the Cold War with the USSR? Anyway, it was a very different time. Anybody grew up in a Warsaw Pact country?
Yeah.
Very different time. The US and Russia, they didn't have a lot of connection with each other. Now that was where the US started doing very serious export control limitations, limiting the USSR from getting key technology to build their military technology. And not only that, the other difference is we had allies in NATO and around the world who signed up to legal agreements such as COCOM, you may remember that term, COCOM agreements, that limited technology from going to the Warsaw Pact. Now, we could argue whether really that's successful or not. I think for the most part, it probably was. Certainly at scale, it didn't mean that the Soviet Union couldn't take and find technology and steal it. They certainly did. But in a large scale industrial level, it did work. But in my mind, I'm not sure we can draw the same conclusions with China. For one thing, the US and China are really strongly linked in many areas. We have over 200,000 Chinese students studying in the United States. We have very extensive trade ties, not just with the United States, but also all Western countries. It's a different situation. The USSR was not integrated into the world. They were maybe integrated into their own Warsaw Pact. They were not integrated into the world. China is. Did the USSR have an entrepreneurial, market-driven economy? It was illegal. I mean, you know, they were very strict. That was not the case. Does China? Absolutely. China has a very robust entrepreneurial market. Massive industrial scale support. They would have, the USSR, Russia would set up, you know, certain research labs and that sort of thing. But in terms of the massive government support, not really. China can. China has trillions that they can spend supporting their industries. And then multilateral leasing agreements, these are export control agreements. Yes, we had them with the USSR. Do we have them with China? No, we do not. We have some loose discussions between areas like Japan and the Netherlands and so forth, but these are not documented declarations like COCOM.
I'm sorry, but you know there was massive government support during the USSR times. All the companies were like owned by the government.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. They didn't really have an industry because it was nationalized.
Yeah.
It was
They were
nationalized
basically
industry.
supporting that because like,
Yeah.
they have like 5-year plans and like this process to be industries like
Yeah. So I think there's limitations of these export controls. And I think one, look, when you go to a company like NVIDIA and say, hey, you can't sell your chips to China, it's a problem because they don't make the money. So that money they could have made and used for R&D now stops. It also limits their ability to build relationships in China with these companies. I think it can negatively affect the U.S. side. On China, I think one thing that, you know, we're worried about dual use for military purposes. You know, this isn't like stealth technology. Okay, stealth technology, you can try to keep it in the country. Chips? We send chips all over the world. They're distributed through distributors everywhere. There's nothing limiting China on the military side of obtaining this technology. It'd be very difficult to keep them from getting this technology. The other thing is, the minute you walk away, you're forcing your adversary, I use that term loosely here, to innovate. It forces China to go innovate alternative solutions. Why wouldn't they if they can't use the technology you have? It's better off you give them, my opinion, again, my opinion, give them the technology because they can use it and depend on it. It takes the economic incentive to build your own. So those are some of my thoughts on that. And by the way, I think you can say the same for China. Oh, well, now before I say that, let me show you some export control failure. Just recently, a couple of weeks ago, Huawei announced a 7-nanometer 5G phone. It'll take some time to really disassemble and really understand it. But it sounds like what they've done is they've taken 14-nanometer process, which they have access to, and they hacked it to make a 7-nanometer chip. That's our assumption. We don't know how they would have obtained it otherwise, because SMIC is on the entity list, doesn't allow to have anything below 10 nanometer. So in a way, we'll see, by the way, the jury's out what happened there. And I think we'll understand that here soon. But so far it looks like a very, very capable 5G capable phone, about the same level of capability as cell phone technology about 3 years ago, which is an incredible achievement. It's a astounding achievement. You know, there's a lot of evidence of them working on advanced chiplet package technology, lots of AI chip startups doing very advanced AI processing capabilities. By the way, apart from the semiconductor world, AI is hugely advanced in China in many different sectors. So to me, it just makes me pause and think, hey, does export control work? By the way, same could be said for the Chinese semiconductor subsidies. They started around 2014, roughly around that time. Probably since then, they've, from what I've seen, they've spent about $100 billion. And their goal, by the way, was to be 70% of their needs for chips to be done indigenously, done in China. They're nowhere near that. They're the biggest importer of semiconductor chips in the world. They import more chips than oil by a factor of 2. You can imagine that. So the other thing is that there's a huge amount of corruption around this fund. They actually have to shut it down recently because even the administrator who was running the fund, I think, is under investigation for corruption. There were 50,000 companies signed up as semiconductor companies. 50,000. So when you're handing out free money, funny things can happen. But there's all kinds of issues around there. So, do these subsidies work? I think, sure, over time, perhaps, but a lot of problems so far. Okay, last part 4, kind of my recommendations. First off, I think before we talk about recommendations, you got to think about, I remember back in the Cold War, we had a tremendous fear of the Soviet Union. We had tremendous fear of the Soviet Union up until the wall fell. It wasn't until the wall fell and all of a sudden this realization that there was no economic backing became known. So part of me feels like, are we creating a monster? Is China as dangerous as we think it is? There's this fear, you can feel it among policymakers in the United States. China has a lot of challenges themselves. They're in demographic decline. Their population is reducing faster than any time on Earth among any set of people, which is driving the cost of labor up. By the way, going to Vietnam, you reduce labor costs by 40%. That's the dichotomy. China is not independent from, they don't have food security. They don't have energy security. They're not independent from an energy usage. There's a lot of limitations by the country. Furthermore, there's political fragility in China based on the fact that, you have a system that pretty much is run by an individual, and by nature, that political institution is going to be more fragile in the face of crisis than one with more stronger political institutions. Economic destabilization, by the way, I lived in Japan right after the bubble had burst in Japan. A similar story about the Japanese real estate market collapsing. Now, maybe you can't run a parallel, but when I see the news of China real estate collapsing, it really reminds me of those times. It led to economic destabilization in Japan. I wonder whether it'll have the same effect in China. On the other hand, we should recognize that and this was important because I think that when we were vis-a-vis the USSR, we made bad assumptions. On the other hand, can we assume that China is just not nationalistic, not interested in, rivaling the overall world affairs or coming up against world affairs? I think that this too is not accurate, right? The Chinese definitely are increasing defense spending incredibly. Their Navy now is bigger than the US Navy in terms of number of ships. They are building up nuclear weapons at an alarming rate. In fact, I heard one US general comment that the rate of investment in warfare and military spending the world hasn't seen this since World War II in terms of the ramp up of military might in China. I think that, so we can't be on the other extreme either. I think that we have to take some middle ground. And this really opens up kind of where I think we need to go. One, I think for sure, wherever we can, we should cooperate as best we can. As I said before, we are linked. And everybody says decoupling. We may be decoupling, but that's going to take 10 years, maybe longer, unless a war breaks out. But it's not something that changes overnight. I'm not sure we really want it to change either. But what I would recommend is then think about, well, why did the West win the Cold War? What happened? And I think it's because of a lot of the strength that the West had vis-a-vis the USSR that really made a difference. And we never recognized it. I think for the most part, we didn't even see it. Things like flexible legal system, the ability for us to have courts and IP rights, legal enforcement of those rights, strong political institutions. I mean, even January 6th to me was very sad, but at the same time, the country didn't fall apart. Long history of research and development, an entrepreneurial spirit, excellent, very sophisticated financial systems, a strong set of intellectual diversity, strong global apps. All I'm saying here is that if you're looking for what to do, strengthen these things, strengthen these institutions, strengthen the things that we're very good at. And we can think of it on the state level, on the federal level. Don't create laws that impede our ability to start businesses or that degrade the things that make the West strong, or particularly the United States. But I have more specific things around semiconductors. First thing for me is startups. If you look at the top 10 VCs in the world, 8 of them in semiconductors, I'm just talking semiconductors, 8 of them almost exclusively invest only in China. 2 of them invest in the United States. It's the amount of money going into startups in China is huge. Of course, supported by the government, but also from private investors. Not so much in the United States, and you can understand why. To get a product out in a chip world, just a prototype costs, I don't know, $20, $30 million, can be. To get something to market, that's $60, $70 million. It's a tremendous amount of money. It's much easier to do an app that's going to sell billions of dollars overnight than investing in a startup. The other problem is exits. We used to have a lot of semiconductor companies running on, but they've consolidated. Now it's the Broadcoms, there's just a few. I mean, in the electronic design world, there's just a few. There's a handful of companies. So the exits are either an IPO or you get bought. And there's not that many companies to buy up these startups. There are other problems with semiconductor startups, that exist. I think that a long sales cycle, from the moment you think of an idea, the moment you can sell a chip, that's a 2-3 year process. It takes a long time. So you can understand. If you're a VC in the United States, where are you going to put your money? It's not necessarily in startups. Now, hold that thought. But yes?
You mentioned the amount of money going into semiconductor-related startups in China versus in the US. If I just look at the amount of money, I could compare, say, Vision Fund, close to 100 billion, 97 or so, versus some of the big funds here, Sequoia or others, substantially smaller, though the results they achieved are very different, as they had a much better expertise and very different decision process of how to invest it. And I would argue there is a bit of similarity here of how those somewhat government-run funds are going to do those decisions versus how the American funds are doing those decisions.
Yeah, in terms of their expertise?
Yes.
Well,
and in terms of the corruption.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly. I don't know enough about that, but I would think that there's a lot of expertise in the US side as well. It's
No,
the
there is
dynamics.
that's what I'm trying to say, that even though the fund sizes are smaller here, even though they make some big mistakes, that even Sequoia has put money into some very questionable things such as FTX, but even then, overall, they tend to put their money into largely reasonable things. And when you look at either the Chinese investments or even other more like Japanese investments like Vision Fund, they make plenty of hugely larger mistakes.
Oh, I see. Yeah. But keep in mind, a lot of these VCs too are, they're Chinese VCs, the biggest VCs. It's not just American and so forth. And so, yeah.
So, Celesta is in Subtel Hills. They put top money into semiconductor from the US.
The other area, by the way, I think this is a picture of a R&D, but think of it this way, university level R&D. A lot of issues here. One, China graduates about 7 times more engineers and computer scientists every year than the United States, 7 times. They graduate at the PhD level for STEM, about 70,000 graduates per year. STEM PhD. The United States, about 40,000. So that is it's a huge disadvantage. You know, you can't produce enough talented technical people to keep up. Scientific publications is very interesting. The region that produces the most scientific publications in the world, anybody can guess? It's the collective countries of the EU. It's the EU. That was surprising, by the way. I just learned that. Number 2, China. Number 2 is China. Number 3 is the United States, right behind.
Using mostly Chinese PhD students, I guess.
And European.
And Europeans.
So that's one issue. I think, something to think about. The other problem, I think, from a university standpoint, people study electrical engineering in the United States. They don't go work for a semiconductor company. They want to go work for Apple. They want to work for Google. They want to work for something new, a new startup, or AI. Semiconductors have not been able to attract the talent out of the United States like they used to have been able to. That's an issue. I think part of the problem, by the way, is that equipment, semiconductor equipment and electronic design is very, very expensive. So universities don't have a lot of that stuff that students can get their hands on. So keep that in mind. Now, why do I mention these things? I think these things really can make a difference. And this is where, by the way, going back to the CHIPS Act, is very interesting that part of the CHIPS Act, they're creating something called the National Semiconductor Technology Center. And this is going to be focused on a couple things. One is they're going to create facilities across the country to be able to do prototyping. This is a big deal because this whole notion of, hey, I got to pay $30 million to prototype, hopefully through this sharing model, which they've had a similar thing before in the past, but this is something that's going to be at a much higher scale. This act is also going to increase all kinds of incentives to create education at the university level for semiconductors. These research facilities are going to be built all over. They're going to create semiconductor research facilities with facilities that already exist, as well as new ones. I think that's going to make a difference. I'm not a big U.S. sort of, I tend to be more on the libertarian side, but I'm hopeful that this will have some positive effect on the sort of the U.S. Semiconductor industry. And then the other area, to me, this just makes, if you don't do anything else but this, why aren't we opening up the world to come and work in the United States? If you have a STEM degree, we have the H-1B visa, but it's capped. It's capped at, I think, 60,000 entries. That is not nearly enough of what the industry needs. If people are eager to come, why not have them come? Same with professors. There's the visas, the J1 and the O1. They can come under these new visa schemes, but these today are very, very limited. It's very difficult to get into the U.S. I think that's, to me, very easy to do. And, unlike other countries that have to spend a lot of money to entice you to come, I think people would gladly come to the U.S. To study, live, and work. We could even set up like a Hotel California. You can check in, but you can't check out. Anyway, just
need to check out.
yeah. This, by the way, a colleague of mine at Qualcomm gave me this chart, and it's really fascinating. This is the U.S. Patent Office data. How many patent applications are being done? When you look at it, you think, hey, we're in good shape. The U.S., we've got the lion's share. Look at all that. But when you look at the data, it's actually frightening. 2 years ago, the U.S. data applications dropped by about 8.3%. And then last year, it dropped by 5%. China in 2022 grew by 22%.
Where is Israel?
So,
Where is Israel on the list? Israel should be an extremely high patent producing country, if I'm correct.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Israel is one of the most patent producing country.
Are those US patents?
These are used patents.
Yes. Oh, just
Yeah.
yes. Okay.
Hey, yeah, and by the way, Israel, I think, has a huge startup, society actually that a lot of startups sometimes don't submit patents, right? Because they're trying to, I don't know if that's the case, but anyway, the point being to me, this is very much a gauge. It's a metric, because at the end of the day, if we're not building intellectual property as a nation, that to me is concerning. And I think that the suggestions and the ideas that I'm proposing would help this situation.
This is not the overall patent worldwide. This is just the
U.S. Patent Office.
U.S. Patent Office that was filed by these
Yeah,
countries.
exactly. And it'd be interesting to look at the worldwide statistics. I just looked at the U.S. All right. There's a lot of other recommendations. I'm not going to go into them all. I think we can talk later. I think there's just an awful lot. Personally, I think of all these things, again, I think seeking areas of cooperation with China is a good idea. I know that's very difficult right now, but I think very difficult for us to really to decouple. It would be a shame if we did. Hopefully, we can find ways to stop the current trends. But anyway, this is really the end of my presentation. I think wanted to thank you very much for your attention. And
Really your email over there, 1956 Magyar email. That is your email?
He's been answering emails.
oh yeah,
from
that's
there,
my
so-
email, 1956 Magyar. Yeah, and though I'm not, my father was. So I don't know where I got the idea, but I thought, anyway, that's my.
What does Magyar means? Is
Hungarian.
Hungarian?
Hungarian.
Okay.
Oh yeah, Magyar.
Magyar, okay.
Yeah. By the way, not related to this talk, but I was in the Terror Museum in Budapest, which is about the Cold War era. And I went to one of the displays that were showing the 1956 revolution. And it was showing university students protesting. And I saw my father. It was, and actually I had other relatives go and they confirmed it. There's a picture of my father in a video running across the street in Budapest in 1956. This was before the tanks came in to the country. Anyway. Okay, well, let's have a glass of wine then.
Thank you.